You're listening to a Changing Times production. Welcome to Voices of the New Economy, a podcast by the NENA Storytelling Hub, produced by the Humanitarian Changemakers Network. I'm really glad that you're joining us for our very first episode. We're beginning this series with a conversation that lays the groundwork for what this podcast is all about. Clear, grounded discussions about how we can build economic systems that genuinely support people and the planet. My guest today is Henry Coleman from Local Futures. Henry works on the front line of localisation efforts, helping people to understand what economic systems change can look like in practice. His work focuses on economic localisation as a powerful, big picture framework, not just a small piece of the puzzle, but as a fundamental shift needed to challenge corporate power, regenerate local economies, and build relationships between people, place, and nature. In this episode, we unpack what localisation means, why scale matters, and how local systems can offer meaningful solutions to climate breakdown, community well-being, and economic resilience. Henry also helps us to rethink some of the assumptions that we often inherit about what makes economies modern or efficient. If you're curious about how the new economy movement translates into everyday life, or how ordinary people can participate in shaping a different future, this conversation is a thoughtful and energizing place to start. Let's dive in. Thank you so much for joining me today, Henry. I was wondering if you could begin by sharing with our audience, what is your vision for the new economy?
So hi, Tiyana. Good to be on the podcast and your first interviewee. I don't know when you'll publish it, but that's pretty cool. My vision for the new economy is definitely more about multiple visions and allowing many different kinds of economies to exist. And many different kinds of economies need to exist because they need to respond to the ecological and cultural intricacies of the place in which they're situated. And that is the one thing that the global economy absolutely can't do and never will do. And it's why it erodes diversity and promotes homogeneity, centralizing everyone into a global market. So the new economy for me is inherently local. There's not just one vision. Like I say, every place will look different, should look different. That's what being human and cultural diversity is all about, is difference and diversity. That's how nature operates as well. So more than there's not just kind of one blueprint, but I'd say the direction that we all need to travel, to be very specific, is in the localizing direction. So the new economy should be smaller in scale, should be responding to, like I say, the biological diversity and the cultural diversity in which it is situated. It should be slower in pace. It shouldn't all be about, increasing speed and increasing extractive economics. GDP is one way we've been measuring economic growth, but we need to look at economic growth in a new context. So what would it mean to grow more small businesses, grow the number of jobs, grow more productive food systems, but to do so in a way that is not centralizing all of the profits in the hands of global corporations. So I think there are visions of economic growth and prosperity, but they all need to be localized. And that localization is moving in a direction. It's not like overnight we're all going to be getting our food from within a 50-mile radius. It's nothing about that. It's about moving in that direction, so supporting a re-regionalization of an economy rather than everything going into the hands of global corporations and banks. Stronger national, regional, and very local economies as well. So that's my vision, and there are so many reasons why I envision that and why I think that's a beautiful vision, which I guess we'll get into.
I love that. And before we dive into localization, and I love the way that you describe localization as like a direction rather than this like destination that we're trying to reach. I'd love to know, what is your background? What like kind of led you into the work that you do? Because I feel like a lot of people in the social impact space, we either find ourselves like stumbling into the work that we do, or it's something that we just like were born to do from the beginning. And I'd love to know, what has your journey as a change maker looked like to get to where you are and to have this, lovely vision that you have for the new economy?
It probably is more of the kind of born to do it kind of thing. I mean, I don't know that I was born to do it. Like, I think if I was born in another context, I would be like an avid ornithologist or, something completely unrelated to economics. But I think it's the need of the day is to actually really look at the system and shift it. So my I came at this from a love for nature and a love for, like I say, birds and diversity, a sensitivity to all of that as a child, and then this sense that everything's getting shitter and dying around me. And then without a kind of systemic analysis, the idea that was left to me was this everything, nature is going to be destroyed because humans are advancing and we're progressing and we're bringing people out of poverty and we're industrializing, and that's the only way forward. That's progress, which is a very sad way to think about it, that we can only have human well-being or planetary well-being, and that these are somehow mutually exclusive goals. And it was only when I started looking at the system, the economic system, that all of that very false narrative fell away. And I recognized that the current direction of the economy, the globalizing, commercializing, corporatizing direction, is actually making life harder for the majority of people, even as it uses more resources and drives species to extinction. So we are in a place where house prices are obviously, you know, I think it's 20, in Australia, um, uh, hang on, let me phrase this properly. But in Australia, the average income, no, the average house is was 4 times the average income 25 years ago. Now it's 9 times the average income. So that's obviously just one example. How much people have to work, how now both parents have to be working in order to put a roof over their children's heads and food on their plates. And so we are struggling as human beings in this system, even in a so-called privileged advanced country like Australia. The human, social, economic impacts of this direction are very destructive, and it's not bringing prosperity. So really reframing that was so important, because it's as this economy, as the global economy grows and becomes more and more corporate controlled, we are losing out. More and more resources are being used, and nature is dying. And we're becoming stressed and disconnected from each other, and we're all on screens. And so to see all of that as tied up in the systemic direction of the economy was really freeing for me, because I suddenly realized that you can shift in another direction, and you can shift in a direction where we can support jobs, well-being, growth, have more time, have more disposable income, where healthy food can cost less if we support with policy the localizing direction. And of course, all of that is very much tied to rebuilding diversity on the land, shortening distances between producer and consumer, less mining, less pollution, less plastic waste. So it's all tied up in that way of seeing things, which was very empowering for me. And that's why I got into the work that I was doing, because yeah, I saw this film when I was 15 called The Economics of Happiness. And the economics of happiness described how described this global versus local, looked at the economy in terms of scale and speed and technology rather than in terms of left versus right. And that was very empowering for me. So I've been on that path basically ever since I saw that film. After high school, I volunteered with the organization I now work for, which is Local Futures, and have been being guided in this work, which is, a pretty rare opportunity to get to do this work and to basically get paid to do this kind of systems change stuff. So that opportunity is something I was looking into chasing right after I finished high school. And then, yeah, I'm still kind of on that path. So I didn't go to university. I didn't study this in some economics course. I learned on the ground, and I learned through being part of this global movement for localization, which is built up of all these different grassroots projects that are very inspiring and basically much more educational than I think what you'd find in a conventional economics course. So yeah, I just stayed with that way of doing things and have been learning on the job, basically.
I love that. I think like, and I can say this as somebody who has gone through like the entire spectrum of the academy to like, from an undergrad to now having a PhD. And like, I love getting a formal education. I think it's such a privilege to be able to do that. And like doing a PhD to get paid to like essentially learn is like such a like wonderful thing. But I feel like I've learnt just as much, if not more, about the world from, things like permaculture and just like growing food in my own garden. Like whenever people ask me what's one thing I can do to like make a difference in the world, I always say like go and start a garden because you'll learn so much about the speed of change and how like, you plant all of these seeds and, not everything is going to germinate. And you learn about, about abundance and in this concept of like enoughness. You can learn so much about the
Mm,
world and,
mm,
just from growing a garden. And so
mm,
I love that you've, been able to build this, career in the space that you work in. And, you've been able to, learn on the job, as you say. I think for anybody listening who thinks like, oh, I've, wasted too much time, in like one career and I'm really passionate about doing something else, like it's never too late and you can always just like learn from doing. So I really love that. I'd love to know if we're talking about localization, and I love that you talk about localization as a direction because I think so much of, the paradigm of modernity forces us to think about the current state of the world or where we currently are in time and space as like final or this like end point. And I love that you think about where we're currently at as having this kind of direction. And there's so many different like trajectories that we could head towards. And so I'd love to know for anybody who's kind of new to the concept of localization or the localization movement, what do we actually mean when we talk about localization and how would you define it in a way that's clear for people who are maybe new to this space?
The simple definition, and I think we should keep it simple because it's very common sense, is shortening the distance between producer and consumer of first and foremost our basic needs. So at the moment, we have an economy which is lengthening those distances at every turn. Food that is grown in this country is flown to another part of the world often to be processed. Nuts flown to China to be cracked open, to be flown back again to be sold to consumers in Australia, or even on the regional level, meat animals that are raised in one side of New South Wales have to be trucked to the other side of New South Wales to be processed, to be turned into meat at an abattoir because all of the infrastructure has been centralizing and then to go back to some big distribution center and then sent out to all the supermarkets all over the country. So all the time this kind of investment in doing things bigger and more global is lengthening the distance between producer and consumer. I don't even know the statistic anymore for how many miles the average meal travels, but it's just going up and up, and that just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that butter from New Zealand is cheaper than butter from Australia in our local in our, even our local supermarkets. It doesn't, and it's the same in Europe. Butter from New Zealand is cheaper in Europe often than much cheaper, maybe half the price than butter from the farm down the road. And so the shortening of distances between producer and consumer is something that can happen from the ground up through people getting together and saying, let's put on a farmers market. Let's support our farmers through a community supported agriculture system. All of these common sense ideas are coming up and people are enacting them. So that's a grassroots way of immediately building those connections of a local food economy. There are also policy measures that we should be really looking at if we think about food system resilience to the supply chain shocks of the global economy. If we think about the need to support regenerative agriculture, which means diversified agriculture, let's look at policies to support young farmers on the land that are growing a variety of different products rather than subsidizing the chemicals and the transport from monocultures of one or two products of potatoes where the farmers only get a fraction of the price, or of tomatoes where half of the, or even up to 80% of the crop is being burnt because it doesn't fit the supermarket machinery. So instead of subsidizing and supporting that system through infrastructure, so-called investments, let's support more farmers on the land, diversified food production, and local markets by designating spaces at the local level, at the municipal level, for food to be sold and shared and traded. Lots of beautiful European cities have had a central market like that for decades and or for centuries. And in the last few decades, those spaces are being replaced by supermarkets because of globalizing policy. And it doesn't have to be that way. We can have local food be the most affordable, accessible food in the marketplace if we look at some of those policy measures to shorten distances between producer and consumer. So, yeah, that's one way of thinking about it. To support place-based education initiatives, to support place-based cultural events, whatever it is that creates the fabric, recreates the fabric of community interdependence. Local finance schemes so that people can invest in their local businesses. Business alliances to keep, that can kind of work together to keep the high street independent rather than chain run. And when you have that, you have more money circulating in the local economy. Lots of studies show this, that if you go and spend $100 at a local bookstore, $47 of that will stay in the local economy. Whereas if you go to a chain store, $13 will stay in the local economy because that local bookstore is employing local lawyers, local, is owned locally and is employing people locally. So there's the kind of business element that small scale renewable energy systems are also part of localizing, rather than encouraging the large scale renewable kind of solar farms and wind farms that are often corporate owned and often export oriented as well, and destroying landscapes, frankly. These are all ways of looking at localization, shortening distances between producer and consumer, building or supporting place-based initiatives and businesses, and it's achieved through bottom-up grassroots initiatives as well as top-down policy change. Kind of a long answer. I said I would try and keep it simple. It is simple and it is common sense, and people do get it. That's why, we shouldn't be leaving the economy to the experts who think that it's all about big is better and growth is good.
Mm.
I think I'm someone who will say that we do need economic growth, but we need localized economic growth rather than globalized economic growth. And I think that that's a message that can make a lot of sense to people and also unite people across this traditional political spectrum, left and right.
I think it's like anything in the world of social change, or particularly when we're thinking about like complex systems change. Like, so often the answer is simple, but it's not necessarily easy. And, most of the objections that people probably have to do with, well, how do we actually get there? How do we do it? How do we convince a generation of like greedy corporate executives to move in this direction that we want? And I'd love to know, what are kind of the most common objections people have to localization as a concept or a movement, and how do you kind of respond to those?
Yeah, okay. There are a lot of, I'd say, misinformation about, well, a lot of assumptions basically that have gone along with this very dominant idea of progress and development that everyone has been brainwashed with, whether they're thinking about the economy or not. One of those things is that we need large-scale industrial agriculture to feed the world, and that we need big agribusiness to feed the world. This is actually very common and completely wrong. So you can produce a lot more food through growing diversified agroecological ecosystems. You need more farmers on the land to do that, but there is a young farmers movement. There's a lot of people who want to farm in that healthy community-based way, not as slaves on monocultures, which is what, of course, the global system was based on. So, and that system was very good at producing food without people, but with less and less people, more and more chemicals and machinery, the system can produce. That's the efficiency of global agriculture and of industrial agribusiness, but it's not producing more food per acre of land. It's not producing more food per unit of water. Actually, diversified, localized systems produce up to 5 times. I mean, some studies show up to 20 times, but generally between 3 and 5 times more food per acre than industrial monocultures. And that's because they can grow a root crop with fruit trees and rows of vegetables, including animals in the agricultural system, which is super important for nutrient recycling and lessening inputs. So they do that by using all of the available niches of nature rather than growing one kind of monoculture, which is a biological desert, and you need chemicals to spray it to enforce that uniformity. And you need chemicals like fossil fuels to create the fertilizers for those systems, all so that you can suit the demands of that centralized economy, which can only deal in uniformity. So it's actually a very inefficient system, and it's not growing more food. We don't need industrial agriculture to feed the world. We need agroecology. We need diversified, localized food systems. So that's one of the things that comes up. I mean, I think you were getting at where does the political will for this come from? And that is of course a really hard question, and there's no way that I can say we're going to be able to challenge the power of global corporations overnight, but I think we can work towards it. And the beautiful thing is that while we work towards it, what we do is rebuild a local political economy, is rebuild a local economy basically, because only through increasing grassroots involvement, increasing community connections, reclaiming some of that dependence been that we've given away to the global system by reclaiming that locally. That's how you build a political movement that really can challenge the dominance of these things. And even if they can't challenge the dominance of global corporations and shift the entire system, they can shift parts of the system and create real tangible benefits immediately while doing so. So it's not like all our eggs in one basket. We're either going to shift the system and revolutionize the system overnight or not. We're going to build local power and create patchworks of alternatives, reclaim local interdependence on each other rather than dependence on distant corporate boards. And that's how we're going to see change coming through from the bottom up. So, yeah, like I say, it's not an all or nothing fight, that we're in a process of change. And so I think anything that we can do to contribute to that process of change is moving in the right direction. And we shouldn't just throw our hands up and say we're not able to do anything in the face of this very powerful system and therefore not work locally.
I like the fact that you talk about change as like a process. And like so much of my own research and my own work has kind of come out of this challenge within the current paradigm of modernity, where we think about change in terms of like changes, or we think about it as like these static differences at 2 points in time. And something I talk about is this idea of like change as like a dynamic unfolding. And I love the word unfolding because I think it really kind of shifts us from this like kind of linear trajectory that we often think about when we think about change. And I think it was Tyson Yunkaporta, the Indigenous scholar and activist. He talks about how a lot of Indigenous cultures, they thought of creation as like this unfolding. And when I think about like the work that we're doing across the social change space, or, when we're building a new economy, it's like we're contributing to this dynamic unfolding and we have no idea what's going to unfold.
Mm.
But I think like part of the work that we do is just, planting all of the right seeds and then hoping that, it all kind of unfolds and emerges in a way that is better than what would emerge if we just sat back and did nothing and, threw our hands in the air and thought, oh, well, the world is stuffed. So what can we do?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's kind of like if you think about it in an ecosystem analogy, that if we plant the right seeds under a forest and then a fire comes in, and the fires are coming, very really, but also there are political fires going on, there are supply chain breakdowns and all of that kind of stuff coming. If we've got the right like seed bank that has been nourished and planted, when the old system crumbles, as it's already crumbling, something better will come up underneath it rather than just a bunch of weeds,
Mm.
which is kind of what you get, I think, when you, as we see the system crumbling now, as we see this kind of faith in the conventional political system crumbling, we get the weeds of, um, you know, not to make it too political, but you get a xenophobia cropping up. You
Mhm.
get old, outdated ways of thinking cropping up. You get people blaming one another. And these are all the kind of alternatives that will arise unless we kind of sow a very different seed bed. So I think we're doing that work of making sure that there are visible, practicable alternatives ready to go for those times of crisis. A system that's these kind of seeds of local resilience are built to flourish in a time of crisis. So that's the hope in a time of crisis as well.
Mm. I love that. I always use like ecosystem examples and like gardening examples when I'm explaining like concepts to do with change. I'd love to know, you're somebody who's obviously kind of at the forefront of the localization movement, and you've probably got, seen some really great examples of localization happening, whether that's in your own community or communities that you've worked in or with. So, for people who are looking for a bit of inspiration or motivation, what are some great stories that you could share that show that this is, not just a great idea that people have thought of, but it's something that is actually happening and is
Mhm.
possible?
I think for me, some of the systems that I've seen that have worked really well are basically the smallest scale that you can. So, the effects of kind of like you can look at like the mental health benefits of people that come to people when they start farming in community together. Often these projects are subsidized through like a mental health support scheme. Social prescribing, which has kind of come on the scene of mental health, is now supporting community gardens to exist in like the back streets of London. And there are projects around Sydney which do this as well. They kind of use NDIS funding to get people growing food together, and they have amazing benefits, and then they sell this food to local markets. But it does need that kind of assistance in a system which favors economically the opposite. Often these projects are kind of co-opting or somehow jujitsuing, getting funding from somewhere else. Maybe they're philanthropy funded. And I think that that's okay. And we have to be kind of aware of that. I mean, something that's been working really, really well in the region that I come from, or the region where I live, are the farmers markets. So, and they're not perfect, but the farmers markets have created situations where farmers are able to pass on their farming to their children because the children actually the next generation actually wants to do that work. They can earn a good livelihood because they're not tied into the supermarket system. These farmers markets are like cultural hubs as well. They're totally part of the attraction of this region and why people like living here. There's big social occasions, there's music being played, and there's farmers being supported, and there's diversified agroecological systems being supported where they're producing often up to 100 different crops in a season. I mean, maybe more appropriate for the farmers market is like 10 or 12 different crops. There's still a lot of much more diversity than you'd see in the supermarket system. And so those systems are actively bringing back biodiversity to degraded land and rebuilding the soil. Um, it's about helping to support the people who are working on those farms because they do not have an easy go at it. Their livelihoods are not being well paid compared to what is rewarded in this system. So the farmers market at least manages to, yeah, create livelihoods for some of those people who want to be doing those work, but there's a lot more potential out there. There's more potential for more markets per week, for centralized local food hubs, which there's some great examples that I heard about at the NENA conference recently. And of course, I've known about them for some time, what what Food Connect Hub is doing in Brisbane. These are kind of examples locally. I think there's some really interesting local finance examples that come out of the US and Canada, cities that are supporting tax breaks for people who are investing in local businesses rather or investing their pension funds in local businesses rather than in these conventional pension funds. That's really good. There are little examples of policy changes that can be made at the municipal level, and often I get to hear about them more than I get to see them. We do basically hear about new examples in pretty much weekly that we might not have heard of before because we've got connections around the world. We're localizing globally at Local Futures. So we get to hear these stories, and we have get to visit people in some really nice examples of coming out of Brazil of people celebrating localization, re reaffirming the value of traditional medicine. Like even that is an example of localization because it's about celebrating and supporting knowledge, medical knowledge that's related to the ecosystem, that's related to the culture, the specificities of that place, rather than becoming more and more dependent for our medicine on the global system and big pharma. So yeah, I heard about a few of those examples this year. I have visited examples in Japan. There's a lot coming out of Japan where people have been pressured so much to urbanize and speed up their lives that this kind of reaction of returning to rural places, starting a local newspaper or a beautiful handmade local magazine that celebrates the local culture and the food culture. Again, little farmers markets coming out of those places and different forms of in yeah. I could go on, but I probably don't need to. Like I say, it will look different from place to place, but there are these common principles, and that is to support diversity on the land, to support interdependence between people, often to create more face-to-face connections, even though there are some good work that can be done through internet apps and stuff like that. But yeah, to support face-to-face connections, um, to I think those are kind of the main ones, like more diversity, more people instead of technology, employing people instead of technology, and creating face-to-face connections between people at the local level. Those are some of the kind of common themes that look different in various different places.
Mm. I was thinking that as you were speaking, like, and talking about these like local markets and things, it sounds like the localization offers a really good opportunity for more kind of like genuine connections with people. And there's like this whole body of research that's coming out now about like the loneliness epidemics that we're in and the effect of loneliness on our health. And a big part of it is the fact that like, and this is what research says, apparently like the closer you are in proximity to like your friends, like the stronger those friendships will be just because you can like hang out with them more and spend more like quality time with them and do so more frequently. So I feel like there's like this huge like opportunity for localization kind of in terms of like the connections that we have with people as well.
Why we call it the economics of happiness.
Mm.
And yeah, there's all just to add to what you're saying, how clear it is how people who have children who have grandparents closer by have stronger self-esteem, have less difficulties with depression, anxiety, and addiction as they grow older. There are very clear correlations. And again, it's common sense. Like we don't need scientists or researchers or universities to tell us this. We actually just need to listen to our own intuitive knowledge. And that's where the growth of the localization movement comes from, is that people are doing it out of their common sense, even when it's not supported by the economic system. And if only we could identify and support those initiatives with the economy, we could see a very different world unfold overnight. And yeah, I agree. Like that, the point about the well-being and about increasing the density of local connections, that's a great way to think of localization.
A final question to wrap things up. For someone listening now who is feeling inspired or motivated and they want to take action, What do you think is that first step that you recommend somebody take to, either take action or to learn more? What would you recommend as a good first step?
So I think one of the most important things people can do is to actually use this word localization. Like actually start using it because when you start thinking about the economy in terms of speed and scale rather than left versus right, you get a very different understanding of what the economy actually is and what's actually possible. And it's just not it's not a widely used concept yet. Like people know that globalization is failing. There's, the Financial Times is even saying this now. Like this is not just a fringe understanding. But to speak of localization as an alternative and again as that direction is really important. And to see it not just as kind of small things that happen. Of course, there is beauty in small. Small is beautiful is like a foundational text and perspective that has inspired the localization movement. But that what we need is small scale and a large scale. Doesn't mean scaling up every small business so that it becomes a global corporation. It means multiplying out and replicating and adapting to different contexts. So that's the one thing I'd call people to do, that and sign up for the Local Futures email newsletter. It is a way to kind of beat the algorithms and make sure that you are getting this perspective in your inbox on a daily basis, or not a daily, but we don't send that many, but bi-weekly, monthly basis. You can make sure you stay tapped into this perspective because it's not something you'll get most places. So please do that. Please see if you can use the word localization in a conversation today, tomorrow. And yeah, what we say is 5 words: reconnect, rethink, resist, renew, and rejoice. So reconnect, get in touch with some people around you because you can't just do localization on your own. It has to be a change the I to a we. In a small group, you can make a difference. You can help to support a local food movement, help to, garden together. Um, you can bring together local businesses, whatever it is that you choose to do. You can shift some of the education that your children or your nieces and nephews might be getting to make sure they're learning about the local place and the local culture and the local economy rather than just centered around the kind of dominant education. So there's all these different ways we can intervene, and those are all examples of renewal. Resistance, let's stay active against opposing the free trade treaties, opposing the imposition of AI. We need to continue to say no to the advancement of that system, which is still moving in that direction. If we talk about the economy as a direction, we're not fully globalized yet. They're still pushing for more. So say an active no to that. And the rethink piece is to stay informed and to continue to practice this perspective. And yeah, that's where the signing up to the Local Futures email newsletter is really important. And the rejoice is celebrate all of that which is still local, all of that which is still joyful. And there are people regenerating ecosystems. There are people putting out a little community library out the front of their house. There are people making bids for connection, even in the middle of big cities. And there are movements like this springing around. So support that, rejoice in that. And those are kind of the 5 words: reconnect, rethink, reconnect, rethink, renew, resist, and rejoice.
Wonderful. I will make sure to link in the episode show notes the Local Futures website. And for anyone who wants to learn more and wants to listen to your wonderful voice, I will link some of the webinars that you've run with the NENA Localization Hub for people who are keen to learn more.
Oh
Thank
yeah,
you.
those are good places to learn about some of the initiatives that are going on because there are people involved in those initiatives who may or even may not see themselves as part of a wider localization movement that tap into this stuff, and then they've shared on those about eco villages, about um, local ecosystem regeneration projects, about local currencies and local things like that. So people can, hear more examples on those webinars as well. There's also on Local Futures website, Planet Local Library of different initiatives. There's a localization action guide. All of that's based on projects that have worked in other parts of the world. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm so glad I had you as our first guest on the podcast. It's been great. Thank you for listening to this episode of Voices of the New Economy. We'd like to close by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands across Australia where we live, work, and record. We pay our respects to elders past and present and recognise that First Nations peoples have been practising deep economic, ecological, and cultural stewardship on these lands for tens of thousands of years. This podcast is produced by NENA's Storytelling Hub. If you'd like to learn more, get involved, or join the hub, you'll find the link in the episode show notes. NENA is a member-owned cooperative, and everyone is welcome to become a member. Membership gives you access to our events, networks, collaborative projects, including this podcast, and the wider community that's working to build a fairer, more regenerative economy. This series is supported by the Humanitarian Changemakers Network and produced by the Changing Times News. Thanks again for being here, and we look forward to sharing more stories from the new economy with you in the next episode.